Okay, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the current perspectives um, uh, of psychology. What perspectives are prevalent now, and how or what has happened to these earlier perspectives. Before that, just to give you a brief review, we looked at pre-scientific, scientific, post-scientific, and modern eras or periods of uh, psychology. Um, Now we'll move on to say like what exists now. What are the current perspectives? Now there are several and perspectives now, and each emphasizes on one specific aspect of complex human behavior. That is to say that human behavior is so complex that just one perspective may not help us to actually provide a bigger picture and a better understanding of the human behavior. So there are several perspectives now, which are mostly evolutions or existing or changed versions of the original schools of thought. And of course, there are some new perspectives as well. And so the psychology now is eclectic in the sense that there are multiple perspectives, and our complete understanding of human behavior comes from an amalgamation, a union of understanding coming from different fields. But there are six major current perspectives. That's what the field commonly agrees on. And these current perspectives are behavioral perspective, psychodynamic perspective, humanistic perspective, physiological perspective, socio-cultural perspective, and cognitive perspective. Again, that doesn't mean to say that these all are prominent. It's just that one is more, they all coexist, of course, but again in different forms when compared to the original roots of schools of thought. And also one may be more prevalent than the other, and also that most of these perspectives, except for a few, actually take cognition as a basis. Cognitive perspective forms a basis for most of this perspective, even if even these are named differently. Most of these perspectives have cognitive science as their fundamental perspective. Um, so we're going to talk about each of these perspectives, um, and where cognitive perspective, as you know, is the study of both human behavior and mental process, if you remember from the history of psychology video. Now let's look at the first one, behavioral perspective. Now it is not as prevalent as it was, say, in 1900s, early 1900s till mid 1900s. There still may be a few traditional behaviors, but when you see in total, there are several behaviors who have actually changed their path from being very strict by adapting very strict behavioral approach to actually adapting multiple approaches. Especially in 1960s, there were several. Remember, 1960s is a time when people moved away from behaviorism and towards a new perspective called cognitive perspective. And this non-traditional behaviors at that time, they changed the course of foundations of how they conceptualized psychology at that time. They relied more on broader learning perspectives as opposed to very specific learning perspectives depending on just the classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Beyond that, they also acknowledged and also studied and incorporated other cognitive factors into account. And there are some and they took a new form of perspective called social learning theory, and also called social cognitive theory. The idea here is that it's not just the behavior that influences one's, sorry, it's not just the environment that influences one's behavior, but also the cognitive factors. That's why you have social and cognitive. Social referring to the behavioral aspect of it, cognitive referring to the mental aspect of it. Same here, social referring to the behavior, learning referring to the cognitive aspect of it. So, they started focusing, they started broadening their focus on both environmental factors and cognitive factors. And this strict behavioral approaches or modified versions of these behavioral approaches are still used or still used in the applicational settings. For instance, these are used in as behavioral therapies. The principles of either traditional or modified version of the traditional behaviorist perspective are till date used in behavior modifications for rewards and punishment. So if you're looking at like sociophobia or especially some sort of phobias, or for treating addictions of milder forms, behavioral therapy actually is proved to be very useful. So you still see behavioral therapy in the applicational arena these days. A modified version of this behavioral therapy is called the cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not just modifying the behavior through rewards and punishment, it's also modifying the thinking process about the situation in hand. So it's not just rewards and punishment, it's also the thinking behind it. And they focus on that as well. That's why it has two parts, the behavioral part and the cognitive part. So that's why it's called cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's about the first perspective. Let's move on to the second perspective, the psychodynamic perspective. As you know, psychodynamic perspective was founded originally by Sigmund Freud, and his idea was that there was this conscious brain, and there is a subconscious brain, and the subconscious brain actually is like maybe like sixth, seventh of the actual aspect of the human experience, and what is conscious is only 1/7, like a tip of an iceberg. So, and he said that, and he proposed that the subconscious actually controls the conscious, however, the subconscious actually is specific to our basic instincts such as sex and aggression. So everything that you're conscious of, that you're doing or thinking, according to this perspective, has some ulterior motives of it related to sex or aggression. Well, this is a very powerful perspective, and actually it has influenced a lot even now, then and even now in terms of popular literature, either in the form of movies, books, stories, whatever it is. We still use those constructs. Whereas in terms of practice itself, or in terms of perspective itself as a field, though, it is still alive, where neo-Freudians, the Freudians, or the Freudians after the psychoanalysts after Freud actually adapted a different, slightly different approach, but based on the same ideas of ideas of subconscious and conscious mind and other related aspects from Freudian theory. But they started putting less stress on sex and aggression, instead actually shifted their attention to such more positive aspects of human experience, such as self-awareness, self-direction, conscious choice. So psychoanalytics is still prevalent, but the focus of their studies or focus of their therapy now is on these positive aspects of human behavior. Now, coming to the third perspective, The third perspective is the humanistic perspective. It's also called a third force because the first two perspectives we just discussed, the behavioral perspective and the psychodynamic perspectives, assume that um, either the external forces in the case of behaviorism or the internal forces in terms of the conflict between the opposing forces from within the subconscious, they control who we are. So it's either the environment that determines human behavior, or it's the um, it's the internal forces that we don't have control over that determines human behavior. Well, humanistic perspective came as, or humanistic psychology came as a third force in the sense that it came as a perspective where uh, the um, the uh, the option is in the hands of the human being as opposed to the environment or the forces within that we don't have control over. That's why it's called a third force. Now, according to this perspective, which is non-deterministic, whereas the behavior and psychoanalytic perspective were actually deterministic in the sense that your behavior is determined by the external and internal factors. Um, Here, the human behavior is not, according to this theory, according to this perspective, human behavior is not under the control of external and internal factors, but they're actually in the control of one's own conscious choice and free will. So no matter what the environment you are in, no matter what the internal forces there are within you, the human behavior at any given point of time, from moment to moment, is a result of one's own free will and conscious choice. So you get to make a each decision or each step you take. So it's under your control as opposed to it being deterministic. And we'll study more about this towards the end in chapter on um, uh, humanistic psychology in particular, where we talk about humans as unique individuals, and each individual is different, and um, human journey is actually finding your uniqueness or discovering your uniqueness and living up to your uniqueness, and that's how you find meaning in life. Again, here the emphasis is on the free will and the choice in this perspective as opposed to the external or internal factors. The fourth perspective is called the physiological perspective. More than a perspective, it actually is, I see it as a methodological perspective in the sense that it goes in line with cognitive perspective, except that instead of theorizing the constructs like memory, learning, actually physiological perspective borrows these terms or these constructs from cognitive science and try to locate the structures associated with these particular constructs. So when we talk about thinking, it's a mental process. They try to pinpoint, well, where exactly does short-term memory exist if there is one? What is memory consolidation? So these theoretical constructs specific to cognitive psychology, physiological perspectives try to determine the seat of these by finding the biological basis of a specific behavior. So that's why it's called physiological psychology, because it's about the physiological aspect of human behavior, the chemical changes that happens in the brain when you remember, recall, or think of something. So they try to find out the biological basis of mental processes and human behavior. And that includes not just the chemical changes, but changes in the genetics or genetical effects on human behavior, hormonal effects on human behavior. All these become part of the physiological perspective. Now, related to the physiological perspective, nowadays you see what is called as evolutionary psychology, which also examines human behavior and mental processes as hereditary traits with adaptive functions, in the sense that whatever whatever behavior that humans are born with, these, according to this perspective, has some evolutionary importance. In other words, the behaviors that we exhibit now, at some point, were useful in that atmosphere. uh, uh, those features, those behaviors may be applicable now or may not be applicable now. For instance, if you think of social phobia, um, when you are in around strangers, some people actually feel very stressed and they start sweating, their heart rate increases, their respiratory rate increases, they become very conscious of the surroundings. Now, according to evolutionary perspectives explanation here, being able to being extra vigilant, being aware of your surroundings more than usual is an important feature for the nomadic humans at that point when we were hunting. So you can quickly identify an animal like tiger and save yourself because your body is prepared now to run away from whatever the danger you are in at that point of time. So these features, these either positive or negative behaviors that we have now have some evolutionary importance to it. In other words, they served some purpose at some point in evolution. Then again, coming to the next perspective, which is the cognitive perspective. As you know, this is the most prominent current perspective, um, and it forms basis of several other fields or perspectives that currently exist. Um, and as cognitive psychologists, as we've discussed earlier, we assume that mental processes exist as opposed to the assumptions of behaviorism, if you remember. And cognitive psychology study how we gain knowledge. It's all about mental process, how we use knowledge in thinking, problem solving, decision making, including basic mental processes such as SAPM, the sensation, attention, perception, memory, which we'll discuss in detail, which we've already discussed in the big picture at a very general level, but we'll also discuss in specific these as we talk about these constructs: sensation, attention, perception, and memory. And the last current perspective we'll talk about now is the socio-cultural perspective. Now, the socio-cultural perspective is gaining um, uh, popularity these days. Especially, this is related to the idea that human behavior and the related mental processes are actually a result are actually controlled by or changed by or influenced by the culture and social environment you are in. In other words, just imagine if you are in the US and you're studying, your typical research participant is a white male or a white female. And when you try to apply the theories that you come up with about human sensation, perception, attention, thinking, knowledge, whatever it is, to people in general, those may not be as accurate, because it seems like, according to this perspective, the environment you live in, the culture factors, all influence our behavior and mental processes. So if you don't widen and test the theories you have about human behavior and mental process in multiple cultural contexts, then these theoretical constructs may not mean anything other than being specific to people living in certain area like US or UK. Also, over time, these theories may become obsolete in the sense that with the world becoming more global, and if your theories about a specific kind or specific individuals of specific background, then you cannot apply it to people in general, even in the US, because now it's becoming more global, not just in the US, but everywhere else. So sociocultural psychology actually, a perspective actually looks at the effect of such factors as age, gender, nationality, ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, lifestyle, sexual orientation, and how that influences human behavior. Well, the current perspective, then, if you remember, this is there are multiple perspectives. So psychology these days are eclectic. There is no one perspective more prominent than the other. It's more like one perspective is used more in understanding one aspect of human behavior than the other. So psychologists these days are more eclectic in the sense that they adapt multiple methodologies, multiple perspectives to understand human behavior. So that's why psychologists these days are multiple perspectives, specialized in more than one perspective. One perspective here now is a methodology as opposed to a school of thought, because current perspectives are not clearly demarcated as they were earlier time in during the modern and post-scientific periods, where there were different schools of thoughts. That's not so apparent these days. The idea here is to understand human mind and behavior um, um, as as much as possible by adapting as many methodologies as possible. So that's why psychology is eclectic. For example, you won't find it's in some years it will be hard to find just a cognitive psychologist or just a social psychologist. You'll find more combinations of a cognitive neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscience psychologist, or cognitive social neuroscience psychologist, and things like those. Well, we looked at history of psychology. We looked at pre-scientific, scientific, post-scientific, and modern periods, what different perspectives there were. And we also looked at the current perspectives. And we, we learned that there is no single perspective, but it's the eclectic approach that current psychologists adapt. Well, thank you very much.